Today, the world is watching Russia as its military conflict with Ukraine escalates, and the country's economy teeters under the weight of international sanctions and domestic challenges. Could this, like the Soviet Union's mess in the 1980s, cause a superpower to fall apart? The similarities are clear. Both wars were bad ideas, invasions that got stuck because of strong resistance. Both showed the weaknesses of armies that seemed unbeatable. And both have cost the attacker a huge amount in lives and money. But is history repeating itself? Could the Russian Federation, a country made up of multiple regions and ethnicities, face the same fate as its predecessor, the Soviet Union? The answer, like most complicated questions about history, isn't easy. There are big similarities, yes, but also big differences that could lead to very different endings. To understand if Russia could collapse, we need to look at how it's run. The structure of governance in Russia is deeply rooted in its history, and to grasp the current situation, we must delve into the past and present mechanisms of power. Like the Soviet Union, Russia today has a strong central government. This centralization is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it allows for swift decision-making and a unified national policy. On the other hand, it often leads to the neglect of regional issues and local governance. The president and his close advisors in Moscow hold all the power. This concentration of power means that decisions affecting the entire country are made by a small group of individuals. While this can create a sense of stability and control, it also means that the voices of ordinary citizens and regional leaders are often unheard. This system, while good for showing strength, often ignores local needs and can cause anger far from the capital. In rural areas and distant towns, people feel disconnected from the central government. Their unique challenges and needs are frequently overlooked, leading to frustration and discontent. The Soviet Union was a bunch of different republics ruled with an iron fist. More precisely, the USSR was a superstate made up of 15 republics, each with its own local government and significant autonomy. Each republic had its own identity, culture, and aspirations, but they were all tightly controlled by the central government in Moscow. This rigid control maintained a facade of unity. However, the USSR's centralized structure left little room for meaningful autonomy in practice, and the regime's repressive control over the republics ultimately led to tensions and demands for independence. When the control weakened, during the economic struggles of the 1980s, the desire for political freedom grew, which led to widespread protests, and eventually the collapse of the Soviet Union. This way, the republics seized the opportunity to assert their independence. Russia today has similar problems. Economic challenges persist, and there is a growing sense of dissatisfaction among the populace. Long queues for basic goods and empty store shelves are reminiscent of the Soviet era, highlighting the ongoing struggles faced by ordinary Russians. Politically and administratively, today Russia is a federation, being composed of 85 federal subjects, regions, republics, and autonomous areas, many of which having distinct cultural and ethnic identities. While it is far more centralized under the rule of President Vladimir Putin, this federation model carries inherent risks. From Chechnya to Tatarstan, from Siberia to the Far East, there are whispers of wanting independence and more local control, challenging Moscow. Between USSR's situation in the late 80s, early 90s, and Russia's present situation, there is a critical similarity: the underlying tension between central power and local autonomy. These could become a flashpoint as Russia's internal pressures mount. The regions have distinct cultural identities and histories, and their calls for greater autonomy are growing louder. The central government's response to these demands will be crucial in determining the future stability of the country. The Kremlin knows about these problems and has responded with a mix of force and persuasion. The government employs a combination of military presence, political maneuvering, and strategic concessions to maintain control. However, this approach is not without its risks and can sometimes exacerbate tensions. It has stopped protests, silenced news reporters, and tried to make Russian pride a unifying force. By cracking down on dissent and controlling the narrative, the Kremlin aims to foster a sense of national unity. Yet these measures can also lead to a backlash, as people grow increasingly frustrated with the lack of freedom and transparency. Wars show the cracks in empires. They reveal the vulnerabilities and weaknesses that are often hidden beneath the surface. When a nation decides to go to war, it often does so with a sense of invincibility, believing that its military might and strategic planning will lead to a swift and decisive victory. However, history has shown us time and again that wars rarely go as planned. They become prolonged, costly, and devastating, not just for the countries being invaded, but also for the invaders themselves. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, was supposed to be quick and easy, a show of strength. The Soviet Union, in 1979, believed that their military intervention in Afghanistan would stabilize the region and assert their dominance. Similarly, in 2022, Russia anticipated that their special military operation in Ukraine would be a rapid campaign, showcasing their power and influence. Both invasions were meant to be demonstrations of military prowess and political control. Instead, they became long, expensive disasters. The Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan, a prolonged conflict which lasted from 1979 to 1989, often cited as one of the key factors that contributed to the eventual collapse of the USSR, drained Soviet resources, fueled public discontent, and undermined the credibility of the government, emptying the Soviet treasury, hurting morale back home, and showing the limits of its military. The Soviet Union found itself entangled in a guerrilla war against Afghan fighters who were determined to resist the foreign occupation. The financial burden of the war drained the Soviet economy, leading to shortages and economic instability. Soldiers far from home faced harsh conditions and a resilient enemy, which took a toll on their morale and effectiveness. The similarities with Ukraine are striking. What was intended to be a quick and decisive operation has turned into a protracted conflict. Ukrainian forces, bolstered by international support, have mounted a fierce resistance. The war has exposed the limitations of the Russian military, much like the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. The war in Ukraine has already been a long and costly conflict, both in terms of lives lost and the economic consequences. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers have died, and the international sanctions imposed in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine have isolated the country from much of the global economy. Russia's special military operation, planned as a quick victory, has become a slow, painful war. The initial advances have been met with strong resistance, leading to a drawn-out conflict with no clear end in sight. The prolonged nature of the war has strained Russian resources and exposed the challenges of sustaining a military campaign over an extended period of time. The Russian military, thought to be super strong, has been shown to be surprisingly weak, with supply problems, old equipment, and low morale. Reports from the front lines indicate that Russian troops are facing logistical challenges, with inadequate supplies and outdated equipment. The harsh realities of war have dampened the morale of soldiers who are grappling with the difficulties of prolonged combat and the uncertainty of their mission. The war is costing a lot of money, made worse by sanctions from the West. The economic impact of the conflict has been severe, with the costs of military operations mounting daily. Western sanctions have further exacerbated the situation, targeting key sectors of the Russian economy, including energy and technology, and limiting access to international markets. The financial strain is evident as the government struggles to balance the demands of war with the needs of its citizens. The ruble has dropped in value, prices are going up fast, and regular Russians can't find basic things they need. The devaluation of the ruble has led to inflation, making everyday goods more expensive and harder to obtain. Sanctions have disrupted supply chains, resulting in shortages of essential items. Ordinary Russians are feeling the pinch, as their purchasing power diminishes and their standard of living declines. The war has also hurt Russia's reputation, making it an outcast and uniting the West against it. International condemnation has been swift and widespread, with many countries denouncing Russia's actions and calling for an end to the conflict. The invasion has isolated Russia on the global stage, leading to diplomatic and economic repercussions. The unity of Western nations in their response has further marginalized Russia, highlighting the far-reaching consequences of its military ambitions. Money problems helped cause the Soviet Union's downfall. The Soviet Union, once a superpower, faced a series of economic challenges that ultimately led to its collapse. The financial crisis was a result of years of mismanagement and an overextended military budget. The government struggled to keep up with the demands of its people, leading to widespread dissatisfaction and unrest. Years of bad economic decisions, a huge military, and low oil prices had hurt the Soviet economy by the 1980s. The leadership's focus on military might over economic stability drained resources that could have been used to improve the standard of living for its citizens. The oil industry, once a major source of revenue, saw declining prices, further exacerbating the economic woes. The combination of these factors created a perfect storm that the Soviet economy could not weather. The war in Afghanistan made things worse, using up resources and speeding up the country's decline. The prolonged conflict drained the Soviet Union's finances and diverted attention from domestic issues. The human and economic costs of the war were immense, leading to further disillusionment among the population. The war not only strained the economy, but also eroded the government's credibility, making it difficult to maintain control. Today, modern Russia has similar problems, reminiscent of the Soviet era. Inflation is rising, and the ruble has seen significant depreciation. Many businesses have closed, and unemployment rates have risen, leading to increased social unrest. This is partly due to the fact that Russia's economy is far more integrated with the global market than the Soviet Union's ever was. The Federation's reliance on oil and gas exports means that any disruption in these industries, especially if the war continues, could send Russia's economy into a tailspin. Precisely because it is not as controlled as the Soviet economy, the Russian economy is even more vulnerable to price changes and sanctions. The reliance on energy exports means that any fluctuation in global oil prices can have a significant impact on the Russian economy. Sanctions imposed by other countries have further strained the economy, limiting access to international markets and financial systems. These measures have targeted key sectors, including finance, energy, and defense, crippling the country's ability to conduct business as usual. The plummeting of the ruble has led to higher prices for everyday goods and services. The economic isolation has forced Russia to seek alternative markets and partners, but the transition has been challenging. The Kremlin has managed to soften the blow by controlling money flow and using its remaining connections, like selling energy to China and India. These strategic partnerships have provided some relief, allowing Russia to continue exporting its energy resources. However, these measures are not enough to fully offset the impact of the sanctions. The government has also implemented various economic policies to stabilize the situation, but the long-term effectiveness of these measures remains uncertain. These are temporary fixes, and the underlying issues within the Russian economy have not been addressed. The reliance on short-term solutions only postpones the inevitable. Without significant structural reforms, the economy is likely to face continued instability. The temporary measures may provide some immediate relief, but they do not offer a sustainable path forward. The longer the war goes on, the more Russia's economy will suffer, and the greater the chance of angry people and political trouble. Prolonged economic hardship can lead to increased dissatisfaction among the population, potentially resulting in widespread protests and political instability. The government's ability to maintain control will be tested as the economic situation worsens. The future of Russia's economy and political landscape remains uncertain, with many challenges ahead. Could all these lead to widespread social unrest and eventual collapse, much like the economic breakdown seen in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s? National pride has always been strong in Russia, a powerful tool that can unite the country or tear it apart. The Kremlin knows this and has tried to use Russian pride to get support for the war in Ukraine and distract from problems at home. State-run media constantly shows propaganda saying the war is a fight against the West and Ukrainian Nazis. This story works on some Russians, especially older people who miss the Soviet times and don't trust the West. But using national pride is risky. Russia has many different ethnic and religious groups. Too much Russian pride could anger minorities and encourage groups in troubled regions to want to break away. In the late 80s, one of the most significant pressures faced by the Soviet Union was the rise of nationalist movements within its constituent republics. By the early 1990s, countries like the Baltics, Ukraine, and Georgia were increasingly seeking independence. The same ethnic and regional tensions are present in Russia today. Many of its autonomous republics, such as Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, and Chechnya, hold strong cultural and historical identities. Should Russia's economy continue to deteriorate, or if the war becomes an even bigger burden, There is a risk that these regions might seek greater autonomy or even independence, much like the republics of the Soviet Union did in the early 90s. Only time will tell if Russia's future mirrors the past or charts a new course altogether. One thing is certain, the outcome of the war in Ukraine could determine the fate of Russia itself. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. What do you think? Could the Russian Federation collapse? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And stay tuned for more in-depth analysis of global geopolitics and history.